am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
In 1965, Robert Oppenheimer spoke those very words as he reflected on the moments immediately after the world's first nuclear detonation. With the advent of nuclear armaments, the very nature of not only war, but rather life itself had changed in an instant. The long-felt security of being away from the front had been replaced with the fear of indiscriminate and instant annihilation. This fear of what terrible machinations our technological advancements could bring and what our world may look like in the near future has since become the central plot device for many of the greatest works of fiction over the last 7 decades. No more so is this true than in anime. With Japan's experience in the waning days of World War II and their nation the only one to have ever endured the fires of a man-made sun, no culture or people may have been better suited to speak and thus create stories relying on these themes. And one subgenre that eventually found life through those creative endeavors was Mecha. Towering machines of war imbued with the imagery of man, capable of far more destruction than any other conventional weapon, and appearing almost godlike on the battlefield. They are, for all intents and purposes, just another weapon of mass destruction. Mecha have since made their way into almost every facet of modern entertainment, whether it be anime, movies, and of course even video games. Most of these early titles would take the form of 2D fighters, shoot-'em-ups, and even the occasional side-scroller. But with the 32-bit revolution well underway, mech games would soon have their chance to shine, and truly give players the full experience that comes with piloting one of these metal-clad behemoths. So welcome to the channel, I'm the SSG, and this is part 1 of the Gungriffon Retrospective. The early to mid-90s were an era of constant innovation and experimentation in the world of game design. Early 5th generation consoles, such as the Atari Jaguar and 3DO, were showing off what could be done with the improvements to hardware and increased storage capacity through the use of CD-based media. Japanese-based publisher Armaments was one of many in the industry at the time, trying to formulate fresh IPs that could make use of these new technologies going forward. Having built up its reputation with its Lunar series and its SegaCD release of Sylpheed, development has shifted to a prototype 3D game engine for what would one day become Grandia. Original development for Grandia had been set for a SegaCD release, but with that Genesis add-on now being abandoned, development has shifted to Sega's new Saturn console. It was from this prototype build of Grandia's engine that Gungriffon would first find life. In-house development of this side project had been relatively quiet, with the only mention of it being under the working title of 3D Polygon. During the Winter Consumer Electronics Show of 1994, American localizing juggernaut Working Designs would have one of the first opportunities for anyone outside of Armaments to see 3D Polygon in action. Presented on the screen of a handheld video Walkman, the team members caught a few moments of a single mech walking around a house. This fateful meeting would regrettably not lead to the publisher becoming directly involved in the first release of the series. However, it would pave the way for their future involvement years later. Fast forward to March of '96 and Gungriffon would finally find its way to Japanese store shelves, ushering with it a paradigm shift in mech gameplay. While it might not have been the first mech game with a cockpit viewpoint, it most certainly was the first to enable the player to move at lightning speeds, utilize a heads-up display as intricate as say the inside of an F-16, and have the player's mech move between ground and air combat at the push of a button. The nearest rival in terms of gameplay, Gundam's side story The Blue Destiny, wouldn't even be published for another 6 months, with the first Armored Core being 18 months away respectively. For all intents and purposes, Gungriffon is indeed a mech simulator, even if it is a relatively shallow one in comparison to others in the genre. What made Gungriffon stand out was that unlike so many other mech games of the time, your movements in-game actually felt as if there was 15 tons of metal behind them. There were no hairpin turns or sudden stops to be found, and trying to make one of those turns even tighter necessitated you forcing down diagonally on the D-pad as if you were trying to perform a barrel roll. Furthering the level of detail and realism in the game, the use of the jump mechanic felt as if the hangar crew had actually just mounted a pair of Saturn V rockets to your back, with the subsequent landing feeling as though it would leave a sizable crater in its wake. Even the terrain you came upon affected your movements, with trees and steep inclines dragging your mech down to a crawl. However, Armaments wouldn't be content with just having solid game mechanics. Like any good dystopian future, Gungriffon needed a backstory, one dark enough to set the tone for all the carnage that would soon be unleashed. Starting in 2002, mass fuel and food shortages become commonplace occurrences as Earth was ravaged by the prolonged effects of global climate change. 2005 would see most nations of the world foregoing their national borders and joining into massive economic and military blocs, all vying for the few dwindling resources that still remained. As shortages increased, the nations of Earth began to fully dedicate themselves to an almost constant state of war and the technological advancements that came with it. The most prominent of these advancements came in 2007 with the creation of the first AUGs, or Armored Walking Gun System. These mechs were found to produce devastating results on the battlefield when pitted off against more conventional armor at the time, and thus the mech race was on. By 2012, Japan, now a member of the Asian Pacific community, had rolled out its first prototype of the HiMax series. These units were capable of short flight, utilized rollers to dart across varying types of terrain, and were found to be highly lethal when faced off against more conventional AUGs. In 2014, the second series of HiMax had been developed, with the first batch of production units being shipped off to the newly formed Japanese 501st Mobile Squadron. Finally, we find ourselves in the present day, 2015. The European and Asian blocs have declared war upon each other, and World War III has officially begun. Your time on the battlefield will be played out across 8 different stages, each denoting a pivotal point in the war's timeline. With the first 4 being available from the start, the devs gave you free rein to start off easy and learn the ropes, or test your skills against an AI that progressively became more competent and lethal in its attacks. Of course, the general array of mid-90s mission types were on full display, ranging from your run-of-the-mill search and destroy to the almost universally despised escort mission, as well as varying combinations of the two. What was refreshing about Gungriffon is how even the most tedious and brutal stages became almost second nature to complete after a fair amount of practice. The enemy AI, while brutal depending on the enemy type, generally only had so much variance in their paths and tactics. Once you had memorized their entry points and the corresponding times they would show up, dispatching them quickly became child's play. This ease of gameplay is indicative of Gungriffon's core gameplay. Put simply, this is in fact a score attack game. Perfecting your skills and shaving a few seconds off your completion time is exactly what the devs intended you to do. In turn, it's where you'll find the most replay value for an otherwise short game. The arsenal at your disposal was also quite fitting, at least as far as the game's realistic physics were concerned. Machine guns, anti-tank rifles, guided missiles, and an absolutely devastating rocket pod. Frankly, if this one weapon had an infinite amount of ammo, say like the machine gun, I would have spammed the shit out of it till the timer ran out or nothing but ash was left on the battlefield. The mass of your rounds was also beautifully conveyed. The beefy blasts and accompanying concussions truly gave a sense of size to your arsenal. Initially, at the onset of each stage, you'd only have a certain amount of ammunition for 3 of your 4 weapon types. As you progress through the stage, however, supplies and repairs could be obtained from friendly helicopters. This almost always turned into a race against time though, as you were pressed between continuing the fight or breaking off to play babysitter to one of these aerial care packages. For most stages, resupplies wouldn't be necessary after you had practiced enough and planned out your strategy. But if you would have you drop right into the fight effectively unarmed, leaving you almost wholeheartedly dependent on these support units. The last mission is especially notable in this case, as what you carried into the fight was literally it, and the devs left one hell of a surprise for you at the end. Now you would think this evolution in mech gameplay, a quite detailed backstory, and a decently sized head start over the competition would have made for a huge success story. Well, had it not been for the game's exclusivity on one console, you might very well have been right. As much as myself or any other Sega fan loved the Saturn, it was without question the underdog of that generation's 3-way bout between Sony, Sega, and Nintendo. As a result, Gungriffon would only see approximately 200,000 copies sold worldwide. For comparison, the first Armored Core released on Sony's PS1 would see double those sales over its lifetime. All that said, Gungriffon would still sell enough units in Japan to warrant its way to the West. Unfortunately for those of us here in North America and Europe, the game would be greeted by a misunderstanding and a localization that butchered all sense of continuity. Remember how working designs were the first real outsiders to see Gungriffon in its early development? That chance meeting was earned through their SegaCD localizations of the Lunar series for Western markets. These ties also meant that Working Designs was obviously one of the top picks for Gungriffon's Western release. Sadly, poor sales figures for both the game and the Saturn led to Working Designs not even pursuing the game. Instead, Sega would be the one to localize, advertise, and eventually distribute Gungriffon here in the West. Originally, Sega had intended to release the game under the title of Iron Reign. According to one Working Designs employee, once word of the name change had made its way to the studio, the publisher went through a few side channels to convince Game Arts to push the name Gungriffon in all territories. Besides obviously being a more kick-ass sounding name, it was probably for the best as far as sales were concerned, as Working Designs would release Iron Storm just a few weeks later. Name changes aside, Sega was by no means done with the alterations it had in store for this game. Let's take a moment to look at the intro FMV, which as a side note is easily one of the best intros on the Saturn, especially when played as MPEG-1 video. In the opening moments we see multiple pieces of German armor, notice the Iron Cross, engaging in combat with what appear to be Chinese Type 99 main battle tanks. As the tide of battle turns, HIMAX are deployed from numerous cargo aircraft, laying waste to what are presumably German forces. Now all that makes sense, at least according to the narrative I explained earlier, but for us Westerners, the in-game menus and manual all told us we're American pilots, members of the UAC's 45th Armored Division, and that the year of this conflict was in fact 2075. Now I can understand in part why Sega would do this. At the time of Gungriffon's release, the Cold War was still fresh on many people's minds. Add atop this, many Americans and Europeans probably wouldn't have been all that thrilled at the idea of fighting their computer-generated countrymen. I can only speculate as to what reaction many parents might have had. Regardless, from a marketing standpoint, it made sense to swap sides as it were. For Western fans of the first game going forward, however, continuity and story would be completely absent. On the upside, gameplay was high-octane, mecha-fueled carnage, no matter which region your disc was from. Looking back after more than 20 years, I still find myself amazed by the huge jump in gameplay and the increased level of immersion that mech games had made just in the first half of the 90s. The genre had been well overdue for some good old TLC, and thankfully this wouldn't just be a fluke or one-off occurrence. With Gungriffon's relative success, or at the very least its mere existence, mech games would seem to have a boom of titles. Titles such as the aforementioned Gundam Side Stories, the Armored Core franchise, even turn-based titles such as Square's Front Mission. Most importantly, we hadn't seen the last of the Gungriffon series, but we'll leave that for part 2 of the Gungriffon Retrospective.